Mr. Speaker, H.R. 6090 is designed to combat the deeply disturbing trend of anti-Semitic harassment in schools, colleges, and universities across the country. We're seeing it unfold right now on our television screens. Anti-Semitic harassment on these university campuses is unfortunately not a completely new phenomenon. As early as 2005, the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights warned that campus anti-Semitism had become a serious problem. In 2013, a Pew Research Center survey of Jewish Americans found that experience with anti-Semitism was more prevalent among young adults in higher education. In 2014, a Brandeis Center Trinity College study found that anti-Semitism was particularly pervasive on college campuses, with 54% of Jewish students on 55 campuses having reported that they experienced or witnessed anti-Semitism during the 2013-2014 academic year. In 2021, the Louis Brandeis Center for Human Rights Under Law conducted a survey of Jewish fraternity and sorority students, finding that most have felt unsafe at some point while on campus and in virtual campus settings. These fears are justified. The catalog of anti-Semitic harassment in America's top institutions of higher learning is there for everybody to see. Those incidents have increased sharply following the October 7, 2023 terrorist attacks in Israel perpetrated by Hamas and its allied groups. In late October 2023 at Cooper Union in New York, visibly Jewish students were forced to shelter inside a library as pro-Palestinian protesters tried to gain entry, banging on doors and windows with the purpose of terrifying them. On October 26, 2023, anti-Israel protesters assaulted multiple Jewish students at Tulane University in New Orleans. On November 3, 2023, a Harvard law student and other anti-Israel protesters physically and verbally attacked a first-year Israeli student at the Harvard Business School while he pleaded with them to stop. From October 7th until mid-January of 2024, the Department of Education has launched 51 investigations into complaints alleging discrimination based on actual or perceived shared ancestry in K-12 schools and colleges and universities. From January 16, 2024 until today, the department has launched over 45 investigations into schools and colleges. These investigations overwhelmingly concern anti-Semitic conduct in these schools. In fact, on April 23, 2024, the Education Department launched an investigation into Columbia University, and we all know what's happening there right now. Hundreds of anti-Israel protesters have occupied Columbia University's West Lawn and erected dozens of tents, disrupting campus life and creating a hostile environment for Columbia's Jewish students. Hundreds of pro-Hamas students were arrested for trespassing after repeated warnings to vacate the area, only to be released and returned to Columbia. A rabbi at Columbia's Orthodox Union Jewish Learning Initiative has advised Jewish students to leave campus because the university has shown that it cannot keep them safe. Columbia revoked the campus access of a Jewish professor who's been critical of school administrators because the university said it couldn't ensure his safety. Speaker Johnson, Chairwoman Fox, and Republican members of the New York delegation went to Columbia University last week, and while addressing the campus were greeted by anti-Israel chants of "From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." What that calls for actually is the eradication of the Jewish people. We all know that expression is abhorrent in our society, and yet it's going on, it seems now, hourly on our college campuses. Mr. Speaker, enough is enough. The surge and the ancient bigotry of anti-Semitism over the years, but especially since October 7th, must not continue. It's long past time that Congress act to protect Jewish Americans from the scourge of anti-Semitism on campuses around our country. The Antisemitism Awareness Act expresses the sense of Congress that discrimination against Jews may violate Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 when it's based on race, color, or national origin, which can include discrimination based on actual or perceived shared ancestry or ethnic characteristics. The bill requires the Department of Education to take into account the 2016 International Holocaust Remembrance Act's definition of anti-Semitism as part of its assessment of whether anti-Semitic discrimination has occurred. The IHRA definition provides a consistent framework for the Department of Education schools, colleges, and universities to apply to police anti-Semitic discrimination and harassment. The IHRA's definition is widely accepted and a vital tool for identifying and addressing discriminatory conduct that's motivated by anti-Semitism, and it's been adopted by at least 31 states. This bill is exactly the type of legislation needed to protect Jewish Americans from harassment and attacks for simply being who they are. I urge all members to support this important bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself such time as I may consume.
The gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I have devoted much of my life to combating anti-Semitism, and I am as attuned as anyone to threats and bigotry aimed at Jewish people. I will take lectures from no one about the need for vigorous efforts to fight anti-Semitism on campus or anywhere else. I am also a deeply committed Zionist who firmly believes in Israel's right to exist as a homeland for the Jewish people. But as someone who is also a longtime champion of protecting freedom of speech, I must oppose this misguided bill. While there is much in the bill I agree with, its core provision would put a thumb on the scale in favor of one particular definition of anti-Semitism to the exclusion of all others, to be used when the Department of Education assesses claims of anti-Semitism on campus. This definition, adopted by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, includes, quote, contemporary examples of anti-Semitism, close quote. The problem is that these examples may include protected speech in some contexts, particularly with respect to criticism of the State of Israel. To be clear, I vehemently disagree with the sentiments toward Israel expressed in those examples, and too often criticism of Israel does, in fact, take the form of virulent anti-Semitism. Many Jewish students no longer feel safe on campus, and some colleges have not done nearly enough to protect them. But while this definition and its examples may have useful applications in certain contexts, by effectively codifying them into Title VI, this bill threatens to chill constitutionally protected speech. Speech that is critical of Israel alone does not constitute unlawful discrimination. By encompassing purely political speech about Israel into Title VI's ambit, the bill sweeps too broadly. As the ACLU notes, if this legislation were to become law, colleges and universities that want to avoid Title VI investigations or the potential loss of federal funding could end up suppressing protected speech, criticizing Israel, or supporting Palestinians. Moreover, it could result in students and faculty self-censoring their political speech. Even the IHRA definition's lead author, Kenneth Stern, opposes codifying the definition that he wrote, the IHRA definition, for this reason. Vigorous enforcement of federal civil rights law does not depend on defining terms like anti-Semitism or racism. In fact, codifying one definition of anti-Semitism to the exclusion of all other possible definitions could actually undermine federal civil rights law because anti-Semitism, like other forms of bigotry, evolves over time, and future conduct that comes to be widely understood as anti-Semitic may no longer meet the statutory definition. Mr. Speaker, we cannot ignore the context in which this legislation is being rushed to the floor in a cynical attempt to exploit for political gain the deep divisions currently on display at college campuses across the country. Much of this activity, whether you agree with the sentiments expressed at these protests or not, constitutes legally protected speech and expression. Some participants, shamefully, have exhibited anti-Semitic conduct, and the Department of Education will rightfully investigate them, consulting the IHRA definition and other relevant definitions in the process. They do not need this legislation to help them with their inquiries. Some students have even crossed the line into vandalism, destruction of private property, and willful disruption of campus life. They too will face legal consequences, and nothing in this bill will affect that. There is no excuse for bigotry, threats, or violence directed at anyone, anywhere, and it is imperative that we confront the scourge of anti-Semitism. And Congress can help, but this legislation is not the answer. Instead of engaging in political theatrics that do not do anything concrete to stop anti-Semitism on campus, we need to put our money where our mouth is. Last year, the Biden administration outlined a comprehensive national strategy to counter anti-Semitism, the cornerstone of which was increasing enforcement actions by the Office for Civil Rights at the Department of Education. President Biden's budget called for a 27% increase in funding for that office. If my Republican colleagues were serious about fighting anti-Semitism, they would have fully funded that request. Instead, they bragged about proposing to slash funding by 25%, funding to enforce the laws against anti-Semitism on campus. They bragged about proposing to slash funding by 25% and ultimately insisted that funding be kept flat despite the marked increase in anti-Semitism complaints. If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, we would be considering legislation to codify the national strategy today instead of fiddling with definitions. If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, they would have spoken up after neo-Nazis in Charlottesville chanted, quote, "Jews will not replace us." If my Republican colleagues were serious about anti-Semitism, they would have spoken up when President Trump declared that there were, quote, "very fine people on both sides of that rally." And just last week, former President Trump downplayed what happened in Charlottesville, calling it a peanut compared to recent campus protests of the Israel-Gaza war, and we heard crickets from the Republicans. We hear nothing from our Republican colleagues when some conservatives repeat anti-Semitic tropes about George Soros or others. I say to my Republican friends, for too long your selective silence on these matters has been deafening. If you mean what you say here today, if you believe that the threats and vitriol that Jewish students face on college campuses is unjust, and that combating anti-Semitism is more than a convenient talking point in your politically motivated crusade against institutions of higher education, then I beseech you, please move beyond pointless gestures and posturing and actually help us protect Jewish students. Fully fund the administration's efforts to counter anti-Semitism and other forms of discrimination. Our nation's students deserve no less. By contrast, this legislation threatens freedom of speech, one of our most cherished values, while doing nothing to combat anti-Semitism. For these reasons, I urge members to oppose the bill, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman from New York reserves. Members are reminded to direct their remarks to the chair. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd suggest the gentleman turn on his television and watch what is going on right now. I'm now pleased to yield 5 minutes to the author of this bill, Mr. Lawler of New York.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
I'd like to respond to my colleague from New York and his misguided remarks. In 2018, the gentleman was a co-sponsor of the Antisemitism Awareness Act, which adopted the very definition that he just objected to. A co-sponsor of H.R. 5924. The definition that would be adopted is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. He was a co-sponsor of that bill. H.R. 6090, which I introduced, which has 59 co-sponsors, adopts the IRA working definition and its contemporary examples. The definition is anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. It is the same definition, and yet now somehow he is opposed to it. Fundamentally, some of my colleagues on the left are allowing electoral politics to get in the way of doing what is right. The gentleman from New York is a graduate of Columbia University, and yet couldn't muster the courage to take the subway north to stop by and call out the anti-Semitism that is running rampant at Columbia University. It is exactly why this bill is necessary today. And so I rise in support of my bill, the Antisemitism Awareness Act. And I want to thank my colleague, Congressman Josh Gottheimer from New Jersey for his courage in leading on this issue. In every generation, the Jewish people have been scapegoated, harassed, evicted from their homeland, and murdered. Many of us remember the Holocaust as the most recent large-scale instance of this, but it was hardly the first in the Jewish people's long history of persecution. Prior to October 7th, it may have seemed like we were making progress in fighting anti-Semitism, especially in the United States. A prime example, Jewish students weren't afraid to attend classes on their college campuses. And yet today, we hear calls for intifada ring out on school grounds. We see Jewish students being physically prevented from going to class, rioters chanting death to Israel and death to America, and so much more. In the U.S., Jews account for only 2.4% of the population, and globally they make up 0.2% of the world's population. The Jewish people need our support now. They need action now. They need to know they have a place in our country now. They cannot fight anti-Semitism alone, and they shouldn't have to either. The Antisemitism Awareness Act requires the Department of Education to use the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism and its contemporary examples when enforcing Title VI violations of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Codifying a single definition of anti-Semitism will help the Department of Education and school administrators who have been feckless clearly identify instances of anti-Semitism and protect the safety of all students, including Jewish students. Now, some opponents may try to make the argument that this imposes restrictions on constitutional right to free speech. It's not true. First of all, a constitutional protection is in the bill. It clearly states nothing in this act shall be construed to diminish or infringe upon any right protected under the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Additionally, speech is already protected under the Civil Rights Act. But when the speech turns into harassment or other prohibited action, and the action is motivated by anti-Semitism, that is when it becomes illegal conduct. And right now, without a clear definition of anti-Semitism, the Department of Ed and college administrators are having trouble discerning whether conduct is anti-Semitic or not, whether the activity we're seeing crosses the line to anti-Semitic harassment. Other opponents to the bill say they would rather see a different bill tackling this. That no reason...
Gentleman is recognized for an additional minute.
That no reason and no political cover to vote against another measure is helpful. I ask my colleagues who would prefer other solutions. Consider the good it will do for the Jewish students, and yes, keep pushing for more change in the future. We need to hold these institutions accountable. My bill has bipartisan support, 59 co-sponsors, dozens of Jewish advocacy groups, including the ADL, the AJC, and Agudath Israel. It is absurd to oppose this on the grounds that it somehow limits free speech. Calling for death to Jews is not protected speech. It is anti-Semitic. And the fact that we have some of the highest-ranking Jewish officials in America refusing to defend the Jewish community because of politics is a disgrace. It is shameful, and it is pathetic. And anyone who votes against this bill because they would rather put political expediency and electoral politics ahead of anything else
Additional 30 seconds.
has no business being a member of Congress. Never again is now, and we must act. That is our responsibility. And I would remind everyone, when you co-sponsor a bill that accomplishes the same thing, nothing has changed. And yet now, we need to backtrack, all because of politics. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, the gentleman's remarks are slanderous. First of all, the bill that I co-sponsored 2 years ago was a different bill. It did not exclude, let me read from this bill, the use of alternative definitions of anti-Semitism impairs enforcement efforts by adding multiple standards, and may fail to identify many of the modern manifestations of anti-Semitism, unquote. That is nonsense. And it was not in the bill whenever that was. I think it was about 7 or 8 years ago. So the two bills are different. Second, I oppose this bill because it infringes on freedom of speech. And there are Jewish groups, such as Reconstructionist Judaism and J Street and Trua, that oppose this bill for the same reason, and they are not anti-Semitic. There are Jewish groups that support the bill. There are Jewish groups that oppose the bill. I have been a supporter of Israel and of Zionism, an opponent of anti-Semitism all my life. I've been active in Zionist organizations ever since I was in high school. And to say that anyone who votes against this bill is supporting anti-Semitism is a disgrace. There are differences of opinion that occur on this floor from time to time, honest differences. Someone who opposes this bill may think that it infringes on freedom of speech. Not. Someone who opposes this bill may note that the author of the IRA definition that this bill would enshrine in law said, don't codify it. The author, Kenneth Stern, said this is a good working definition that may indicate anti-Semitism. So are the other two. But it should not be codified into law because that could make, depending on the circumstances, free speech illegal. The author of the IRA definition said that. So there may be legitimate differences of opinion between those who support this bill and those who oppose this bill. But to say that anyone who opposes this bill supports anti-Semitism is a disgraceful slander. I'll reserve.
The gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Costa.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the gentleman. I do rise today in support of the Antisemitism Awareness Act. We all know that since Hamas's brutal and barbaric attack on Israel on October the 7th, 2023, we've seen an absolute explosion of anti-Semitic attacks and violence, now, especially on our college and university campuses. There's no doubt that the free exchange of ideas is a crucial pillar of our freedom. But there's also no doubt that the conversations must be grounded in truth and respect for one another. Leadership at institutions of higher learning across our nation have allowed these anti-Israel protests and anti-Semitic protests to descend into absolute chaos. And ultimately, they have failed to support Jewish students. Such hatred has no place in our society. Mr. Speaker, by clearly defining anti-Semitism, the Antisemitism Awareness Act will help the Department of Education better enforce federal anti-discrimination laws. This bill will, for the first time, codify protection for Jewish students who are and have been subject to anti-Semitic harassment, intimidation, and violence. It's imperative that all students feel safe on their campuses. And as such, I urge this body to pass this critical legislation and do what university leaders will not do, and that's condemn these acts of hatred and support Jewish students across the country. I'm proud to support my colleague, Mr. Lawler, in supporting this legislation, and I look forward to voting for it today. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. The gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I now yield 3 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Gottheimer.
Gentleman is recognized for 3 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to address the House and ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of my bipartisan bill, the Antisemitism Awareness Act, to ensure that we're standing up to the Jew hatred that's spreading like wildfire on campuses across our country. I'm proud to lead this legislation with my friend and fellow Problem Solver Caucus member, Congressman Mike Lawler from New York. As we are voting today, in real time, our country's universities are experiencing a tidal wave of anti-Semitism. Protesters have targeted Jewish students, haranguing them with awful Jew-hating insults and cheering on Hamas, a barbaric foreign terrorist organization that murdered Americans on October 7th and still hold 5 living Americans hostage, including my constituent, Idan Alexander. I met with hostage families just this morning. I saw these protests up close, like many Americans did, at Columbia earlier this month. I've heard the sickening, Jew-hating, anti-Semitic comments comparing Zionists to Nazis, promising a redux of October 7th 1,000 times over, and calling for resistance, I quote, by any means necessary, and intifada revolution. Intifada is used to call for violent uprising against Israel and Jewish people. These protests embolden Hamas, America's Iranian-backed terrorist. In fact, they've put out a statement lauding protesters as, quote, the leaders of the future. That's what our enemies said about the pro-Hamas protesters at these universities. Let me clear up any confusion, since I'm a huge champion myself of free speech. This bill protects the First Amendment. It allows criticism of Israel. I ensured that. It was critical to me. It doesn't allow calls for the destruction or elimination of the Jewish state. But it certainly allows criticism of Israel. Even more, it reminds us that our universities have a Title VI obligation to stamp out harassment on the basis of race, color, or national origin. Colleagues, we cannot stand idly by as protesters call for the deaths of Jews on college campuses and across the country. This bill will require the Department of Education to use the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA, definition of anti-Semitism when carrying out Title VI investigations. IHRA's anti-Semitism definition is the most widely recognized in the world, used by 36 states. It condemns, 36 countries, I should say. It condemns traditional hatred and the ugly, modern anti-Semitism that we're seeing on college campuses. There shouldn't be anything controversial about this bill. As was mentioned when it was first introduced in 2018, 50 Democrats and Republicans co-sponsored this legislation, including members who are still in this body. Right now, the Department of Education has 137 active Title VI investigations, some of which have been open for years. The bill will give investigators a clear framework to evaluate anti-Semitism and finally harass.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Speaker, I yield the gentleman an additional minute.
The gentleman's recognized for an additional minute.
Thank you, Ranking Member. The bill will give investigators a clear framework to evaluate anti-Semitism and finally hold harassers accountable. Don't just take my word for it. 30 of our nation's leading Jewish groups back this bill. Under the last 3 administrations, the State Department has used the IHRA definition to monitor anti-Semitism worldwide. This bill takes a common-sense step to formalize the IHRA definition for our education systems. Again, 3 administrations accepted this definition of anti-Semitism. When I was at Columbia University last week, I told administrators that we need deeds, not words, to protect Jewish students. Colleagues, I'm making the same ask of you. This bill is a critical step we can take to stand against hate. I hope my colleagues on both sides of the aisle will join us in supporting this legislation and standing strong up against anti-Semitism. No excuses, no claims of commas that they don't like, just standing strong today against hate and anti-Semitism. It's what our country should stand for. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield.
And yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Molinaro.
The gentleman's recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would never question those who oppose this legislation's beliefs, their ideology, their religious faith. I do, however, question the motive. We are in a moment of choosing, and there are not 2 legitimate sides to this issue. The erection of encampments on college campuses isn't an expression of speech. It is a direct threat to Jewish students on college campuses. Those who spew hate and ignorance and anti-Semitism in multiple horrid forms isn't simply an expression of one's constitutional right. It's an infringement on the rights of Jewish students. They are those who conduct themselves in this way are wrong. They harass students, Jewish students who are innocently attempting simply to study. I know it. I've seen it firsthand as I've visited students at Cornell and Binghamton in upstate New York. And these students who think that they're simply extending their freedom of speech without understanding the hate, the ignorance, the violence that is emboldened by it. And they're wrong to feel entitled that they can simply occupy buildings and public spaces and damage public property. They are wrong. Congress should not only establish a firm commitment to the basic definition of anti-Semitism, but it ought to speak with clarity that this is wrong. And perhaps if we had said that decades ago, we wouldn't see the escalation that we are seeing today. Perhaps if college presidents simply accepted responsibility for the safety and security of their Jewish students, we wouldn't see the violence we have today. We wouldn't need law enforcement on college campuses to protect students. My God, we don't and should never need that kind of enforcement to protect the rights of innocent students, not intense, not occupying buildings, not threatening hate, violence, or ignorance. We shouldn't need that kind of enforcement to ensure Jewish students could simply be Jewish students. And for that reason, I not only support the bill, the resolution, I encourage my colleagues to do the same. Speak with clarity at this time of choosing.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California reserves. The chair will receive a message.
Mr. Speaker, messages from the Senate.
Mr. Speaker,
Madam Secretary.
I have been directed by the Senate to inform the House that the Senate has passed without amendment H.R. 1042, an act to prohibit the importation into the United States of unirradiated, low-enriched uranium that is produced in the Russian Federation and for other purposes.
Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, every bit of conduct that Mr. Molinaro described is loathsome, as he says. But that does not mean that we ought to pass a bill that threatens freedom of speech. This bill will do nothing to help stamp out anti-Semitism on campuses or anywhere else, but it will threaten free speech for the reasons I stated before. I now yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Mr. Cohen.
Gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate my chairman, and I also found the remarks that were directed to you to be reprehensible. I know you, and I know your commitment to fair play in the First Amendment. However, I have questions about this bill, and that's why I'm here to listen to the debate. Now, I don't know if Mr. Lawler would want to respond, but there's another bill, Representative Manning and Representative Smith's bill. It's bipartisan, has, I think, 15 members of each party on it. I've been trying to get on it, but they're doing this crazy balancing act that eliminates certain people. Would you support, Mr. Lawler, H.R. 7921 and work with Mr. Smith to get that brought to the floor?
Sure. I think any legislation that we can bring forward to combat anti-Semitism is critical. And I think, Ms. Manning and Mr. Smith have done a great job working to bring a piece of legislation forward. I've introduced a number. This is but one of them. But I think the objective is to clearly define anti-Semitism and force accountability on these administrators and make sure the Department of Education has the teeth to enforce the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Thank you, sir, and I appreciate your support for that. I think it's very important. I think it's a more inclusive bill, a broader bill, and it takes in not just the problems at the universities, but also takes in problems in the community at large. There's been anti-Semitism for over 2,000 years. The Jews have a homeland, and before they had a homeland, they didn't have that sense of security any place where they were. It's been threatened so many times in so many places over the years, and it should not be taken from them. I was concerned, and Mr. Nadler made the point, that in 2017 at Charlottesville, there were national socialist movements, Vanguard America groups, traditional workers' parties, Klan members, all kind of right-wing anti-Semitic crowds, racist skinheads that were in Charlottesville and marched around saying Jews will not replace us. And President Trump said there are good people on both. Thank you, sir.
Recognized.
President Trump said there are good people on both sides. Well, there are good people on both sides in Columbia, but there were not good people on both sides in Charlottesville. And that anti-Semitism needs to be addressed, and it has not been addressed by my friends on the other side, although Mr. Smith has addressed it and there are others. So I don't want to paint a broad brush. but there have been so many instances in history that have come not from these Palestinian supporters, but from skinheads, neo-Nazis, and Klansmen. And that needs to be addressed, and I think Mr. Smith and Ms. Manning's bill addresses it. So I hope that comes to the fore, and we do a comprehensive attack on anti-Semitism. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Smith.
Thank my friend for yielding.
I
first want to thank
2 minutes.
Mr. Lawler for his very, very passionate and articulate defense of our Jewish brethren. It was very, very moving, and I want to thank him for that. You know, 42 years ago, my first human rights trip as a congressman was to the Soviet Union to defend Jews against pernicious anti-Semitism. I never thought, however, that the anti-Semitic hate that I saw in Moscow and Leningrad could ever happen here. But it has. It is happening, and it's escalating. The bigotry, intolerance, prejudice, and unbridled hatred for Jews and the nation of Israel exploding on American college campuses today is absolutely disgraceful. It is morally impermissible and illegal that Jewish students are the targets of anti-Semitic hate and violence. In both word and deed, Hamas is a terrorist organization that commits mass murder of Jews and seeks the evisceration of Israel. Don't believe it? Remember the horrific violence of October 7th and the ongoing ordeal of the hostages. Or just read the Hamas Charter of 1988, the blueprint for genocide against Jews, a modern-day Nazi-like final solution. As co-chair of the House Bipartisan Task Force for Combating Anti-Semitism, I do want to thank my good friends and colleagues Mike Lawler and Josh Gottheimer for authoring the Antisemitism Awareness Act. This important legislation will codify the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism into Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the landmark anti-discrimination law. Schools that receive federal funds must comply with Title VI, and this bill will clarify that the Hamas hatred infecting our campuses must be dealt with as anti-Semitic discrimination that violates civil rights. Special thanks, Mr. Speaker, to the police, who at great risk to their own personal safety are trying to mitigate the threats to Jewish students. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, again, anti-Semitism is a terrible thing. Hamas is a genocidal organization which wants to kill all Jews, not just the state of Israel. There's no question about that. And there's no question we have to fight anti-Semitism. There's no question the Manning bill is a good step in that direction. There's no question we ought to give the Office of Civil Rights a 25% increase the President has requested to enforce Title VI on college campuses, where there is no question there's been vile anti-Semitism. But that does not mean we should pass this bill. This bill enshrines the IRA definition. And I would remind you that the IRA definition's chief author, Kenneth Stern, said, don't codify it in law, because it would be, if codified into law, it would be destructive of free speech. The author of the IRA definition said that. The bill also specifically excludes the Jerusalem and Nexus definitions. There's no good reason for that. All three definitions give examples of things that may be seen as anti-Semitism, that may indicate anti-Semitism. None of them should be codified into law, as this bill would do for one of them, and I don't know why one and not the other two, but this bill would enshrine one of them into law against the will of its own author, who said, this is my best definition, but don't enshrine it into law, don't codify it rather into law, because if it's made law, it could infringe free expression. And that is why not only the ACLU, but J Street, TRUA, the Reconstructionist Jewish Movement, and a dozen other Jewish groups oppose this law. Not because they support anti-Semitism, they obviously don't, but because they both oppose anti-Semitism and support freedom of speech. And those of us who oppose anti-Semitism and support freedom of speech ought to vote no on this bill. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the Education and Labor Committee of the House, Ms. Fox of North Carolina.
Gentlelady is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank my colleague from California. America's colleges and universities are experiencing an explosion in anti-Semitism, including explicit support for terrorism. That these taxpayer-funded institutions have become forums for promoting terrorism is unacceptable. Campus life has become a daily trial of intimidation and harassment for America's Jewish students. 2 months ago, 9 brave Jewish students described for the Education Committee how their schools have become hostile environments that include death threats and physical attacks. At numerous schools, unlawful encampments now disrupt learning and endanger students. At Columbia, a campus rabbi warned Jewish students to leave campus. A Jewish Yale student was stabbed in the eye. The Antisemitism Awareness Act would provide a needed tool to help better determine anti-Semitic intent, which in turn would help ensure the safety of Jewish students. I commend Representative Lawler for this bipartisan, bicameral bill and urge its passage, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Generally yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York is recognized. He reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the Chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, Mr. Jordan of Ohio.
The gentleman from Ohio is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentleman for yielding. Calls for the destruction of Israel, our dearest and closest ally, are wrong. And attacks on Jewish students on college campuses are wrong as well. So I want to thank Representative Lawler, Representative Gottheimer for this fine piece of legislation, and I want to thank the Chairman of the Immigration Subcommittee of the Judiciary Committee. The only way you stop this kind of stuff is to take action. And the Judiciary Committee started that yesterday. We sent a letter both to Secretary Blinken and Secretary Mayorkas asking 3 simple questions. Are the people engaged in this activity, this wrong activity, this radical activity on campuses against Jewish students, are they here on a visa? And if they are, is the State Department taking actions to revoke that visa? And if the State Department is taking those actions, is the Department of Homeland Security looking to remove these individuals? Pretty basic questions. Pretty important questions I think the Congress has a right to know about and the American people have a right to know about if we're ever going to stop the egregious activity going on. In order to stop it, you got to take action. We're a legislative body. We have a piece of legislation that begins that process. Let's pass this legislation. And then let's do the oversight and get the answers to those questions so the bad guys doing this stuff on college campuses can't do it on a visa. Remember, at Columbia, 55% of the student body is here on a visa. So maybe the American people have a right to know the answers to those 3 questions. We posed them yesterday to Secretary Mayorkas and Secretary Blinken. Let's hope we get an answer soon. Let's hope the Biden administration steps up and starts taking action to stop what is going on. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Carter.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise today in support of H.R. 6090, the Antisemitism Awareness Act. The pro-Hamas protests that we are seeing now play out on TV that are taking place on college campuses are living proof of what happens when we tolerate hate and ignorance. I recently spoke with the aunt of a 4-year-old girl who saw her parents and her siblings murdered on October the 7th by Hamas. And she was held hostage for 51 days. A 4-year-old held hostage after seeing her parents killed in front of her. That's the behavior that anti-Semitic college students are tolerating. It's disgusting. And it's criminal. And they're learning it from those at the very top. We had a hearing not too long ago where college presidents refused to state that calling for the genocide of Jews was against their code of conduct. Jewish students should feel safe on campus and deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. All students do. The Department of Education needs to use every tool at its disposal to provide Jewish students with a safe environment to learn. Our laws should clearly reflect that discrimination includes the indisputable anti-Semitic rhetoric calling for violence against Jews. There are far too many inexcusable examples from this year alone, and this must stop. It cannot go on. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California reserves. Gentleman from New York reserves. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Mann.
Gentleman is recognized for 2 minutes.
I want to thank the gentleman for yielding. The events unfolding on our country's colleges and universities is devastating. For years, we have taught Americans and committed ourselves to never again. Yet, we are watching the rot of anti-Semitism stain our American colleges and universities. We must reject the spoil of anti-Semitism and adopt a clear definition of what anti-Semitism is to better position college administrators and officials to respond to the terror these so-called protesters are bringing to Jewish students. Many of these are not pro-Palestinian protests. They are ill-informed mobs who believe that Hamas, a terrorist organization, is somehow good for the people of Gaza. It couldn't be farther from the truth. Hamas continues to use innocent lives as human shields and intentionally positions civilians in the middle of combat zones while using their tunnels to protect their own military leaders and fighters. Is this what our nation's students want to support? And to my colleagues across the aisle who have chosen to praise these anti-Semitic protests, is this what you stand for? School administrators cannot straddle both sides of the fence here. We would not tolerate this sort of behavior toward any other group of students, and we must not start when the target is again on America's Jewish students. All students deserve a safe learning environment, and by adopting this definition of anti-Semitism, our college campuses are more empowered to uphold and protect safe environments for Jewish students. Congress must be clear. America stands with Israel, and we stand with Jewish students across every college campus in America. I urge all of my colleagues to stand with Jewish students and vote in favor of this legislation. Thank you, thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from New York reserves.
Mr. Speaker,
gentleman from California is recognized.
I'm ready to close when the gentleman from New York is ready.
Gentleman reserves.
I'm prepared to close.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I strongly support meaningful action to combat anti-Semitism. Unfortunately, that is not the legislation before us. We risk threatening freedom of speech while providing no new tools that the Department of Education does not already have to investigate claims of anti-Semitism. The White House has developed a strong blueprint for countering anti-Semitism, and there is already legislation to implement these policies. We should be working together to pass that legislation and to provide our civil rights enforcement agencies with the resources they need to address anti-Semitism wherever it occurs. This legislation is a distraction from the important work ahead of us to protect our students and all those who face discrimination. And not only is it a distraction, it threatens freedom of speech. I urge members to oppose it, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, you cannot fight anti-Semitism if you cannot define it. And the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance offers us a clear and widely accepted definition rooted in this tragedy of the ages. After that horrific crime against humanity, the civilized nations of the world took a sacred oath: never again. To support that oath, these United Nations restored the Jewish state to its historic homelands. That state is now under attack at home and abroad. And with this act, America stands with our Jewish brethren at home and abroad. I yield back.
Yields.